Welcome to Security Take 2, Real Serious Security. I'm Chester Wisniewski, your host, and my co-host here is Ben Verscharen.
This is episode 2, recorded on August 15th, 2024. And today, we're going to be talking about the Garmin breach. For those of you that aren't aware, Garmin is a massive consumer, and from what I discovered from this, is also a massive corporate brand as well. They specifically have technology in both avionics as well as like personal consumer devices, bike computers, watches, that kind of thing. On the 23rd of July in 2020, all of their SaaS services went offline for all of their services. And it wasn't until 4 days later that they actually issued a press release to indicate that they were experiencing issues and acknowledged that it was a cybersecurity issue. So all of Garmin's services were affected, both consumer and corporate business. And people were complaining and wondering online what was actually going on. Do you want to go into what that looked like a little bit more, Chet?
Well, yeah, I'll just comment briefly on the communications there. I think that's an interesting point because obviously I'm a user. I have one of their watches. I have a bike computer from Garmin, and I wasn't a customer at the time in 2020, so I didn't notice the outage. But it's one thing to disrupt my ability to maybe synchronize my profile with my smartwatch. It's another thing when you talk about their other services you mentioned, right? Because I know they do a lot of stuff for pilots. There's a thing called Fly Garmin, and they have a product called Garmin Pilot that helps pilots file flight plans and things like that directly from an iPad or from a other type of device. And, those things being offline had a much bigger impact on people's lives than maybe not syncing their smartwatch. So that communication being initially saying, we're having maintenance right now, which was not true. And then following that up later with, we're having an outage, which at least was true, but I'm not sure why you would hide that it's a cyber incident, because I think people need, when they're unavailable to get your services as normal, they need to have some expectation of when it's going to come back. And I almost feel like you get some empathy from your customers as well. So I'm not quite sure why you would not disclose it was a cyber attack so that people could prepare for perhaps a more extended outage than some maintenance.
And just on that as well, and I know, you said it doesn't really matter about consumer devices. As a serious cyclist, there's nothing worse than getting back from a bike ride and being like, why isn't my ride syncing? Why can't I get it into Strava? Why can't I analyze every single angle of my ride? But I actually think there's nothing worse as a consumer not knowing why something is working. So corporate aside, I would say consumer side, you want a notification. And just prior to recording from this, GitHub was down, Strava was down. My life was in ruins for a moment. So communication is absolutely key. And 4 days later to acknowledge that something happened is pretty appalling.
Well, let's talk about what did happen, because that should make it obvious that they knew what had happened, which is they were ransomwared. They were attacked by a ransomware brand called Wasted Locker. And there's lots of rumors about that I think we'll probably talk about next. But, they did have a ransomware incident, just to conclude that. So in that case, you've got, ransom notes on all your computer screens. You know what's happened, right? It's not just a generic outage. It's not maintenance. If it is maintenance, it's very deferred, unplanned maintenance to replace your security solution potentially. But Wasted Locker is not a brand that I think if you asked even IT security professionals, what ransomware brands come to mind, I don't think Wasted Locker would even rank, but it really did have a bit of a tear in early to mid 2020. I believe it kind of first appeared around May, and the Garmin attack was one of the larger ones. There's actually another one I have for another episode idea, Ben, that came out of this that was also a Wasted Locker victim that I think is interesting. But they were kind of popular in that time window, but their heritage is a bit murkier. It looks like they were part of what's known as Revil or Evil Corp. And Revil was a ransomware brand allegedly operated by Evil Corp. Evil Corp's also known for a malware strain called Dridex, which used to be a banking Trojan, but kind of pivoted into other endeavors, including ransomware later down the road. They also appear directly related and to be a successor to BitPaymer, which was also attributed to being part of the Evil Corp empire of Russian cyber skullduggery. And BitPaymer was a previous ransom brand also operated by that group.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, like Evil Corp, you mentioned, were associated with Dridex. Dridex has been around since 2006, 2007, and was specifically focused on information stealers and specifically diving into that, banking Trojans, right? So this group's been operating for a good part of almost 20 years.
Absolutely, and through the banking Trojan arm of the business or phase, I don't know, they're like teenager. Do they go through phases? I'm not sure quite how to describe a ransomware criminal operation, but they were alleged to have thieved about $100 million US through their banking Trojan operation, and that is what got them indicted, which I think is probably the core most debated thing about this Garmin ransomware incident as a whole. If you look for news stories from mid 2020, there's a lot of speculation that if Evil Corp's behind this and they were indicted by the U.S. Treasury Department for stealing $100 million with their banking Trojans, that would make it illegal to pay the ransom. And yet we know allegedly Garmin paid the ransom. I think we all know Garmin paid the ransom.
It's been confirmed, or as good as confirmed, that they paid the ransom. I don't think they ever put it in a public release, but if you look at the decryptor and how they became operational again, it's pretty obvious they paid. But to go back to Wasted Locker, which was, let's say, the variant of ransomware in this attack, I actually found the delivery method of the ransomware incredibly interesting. And I say that because typically when you think of ransomware attacks, we start talking about business email compromise or phishing. But it actually, what's interesting about Wasted Locker is they compromised a bunch of news websites, and their delivery method was to get malware onto a news website and then do drive-by attacks. And they actually infected, I think it was 30 of the Fortune 500 and a number of other organizations across the world as well. So their delivery method of a fake Chrome update that was embedded in a legitimate website is what started this attack. So it wasn't just a run-of-the-mill, let's try and phish C-level executives, let's try and phish, an IT administrator. Their delivery method to actually get their initial foothold inside of the organization is actually a very different tactic than what we typically see. I don't know if you agree with that, Chet.
Well, it's certainly not been common in a long time. Of course, poisoning websites to serve up malware to people is nothing new, but it kind of vanished into the sunset in 2012, 2013, when we had finally gotten rid of Flash in our browsers, and Java making like drive-by exploitation really easy meant they had to move to social engineering, which is what they're doing here with the fake Chrome update. For folks that are interested in this particular attack technique, you can go out there on your favorite search tool and look up SOCGHOULISH, SOCGHOULISH, which is basically the service that was being used to deliver the malware. And in this case, that malware once again was using good tools gone wrong, PowerShell, Cobalt Strike, commodity stuff that good security tools should be able to pick up on.
Yeah. And once the payload was delivered, for those of you that aren't aware how these things typically happen, you run, say, the fake installer, the fake updater. That then talks back to what we call a command and control server. And once that device is talking to the command and control server, the attackers essentially have what we would call remote access to that device and the ability to conduct what we call lateral movement, which is the aim to then try and spread to as many devices as you can within that network, as well as spread into the server infrastructure. And the whole aim is to get as much of a footprint in that network as possible. And then from there, that's when we typically see the ransomware executed, which then starts encrypting files.
So not to confuse folks, but we have to get in the Wayback Machine here for a second, because if we were describing a ransomware attack today, Ben, we would probably talk about how they tried to find the valuable data to steal, how they had to set up a copy on an account on mega.com to upload all the stolen data, maybe how they might have encrypted or compressed that data. In this case, it was not something Wasted Locker did at that time. They were not one of the groups that had adopted doing exfiltration, stealing the data. They were just locking it up and demanding money for the keys. So arguably a little less damaging. I mean, numerous times Garmin made public statements they didn't believe user data or Garmin Pay data or other things were stolen, which is probably true. This group wasn't known for stealing stuff. And in fact, it was even a pretty recent phenomena that data theft was part of ransomware attacks. I believe it was in late 2019, around September, October timeframe, that we started seeing the first inklings of ransomware groups regularly stealing data and encrypting it. And not all groups adopted that methodology. And this attack was less than a year after the beginning of this trend toward data theft as well. So in a way, I guess Garmin dodged a bullet.
Well, especially with their aviation division. If they had have had data exfiltrated, I'm sure there would be a lot of valuable information that we wouldn't have wanted on the internet at all. Not to mention, we don't want to see people cycling power data released on the internet. But all jokes aside, you're right. They're incredibly lucky. In saying that, it was a $10 million ransom, and $10 million to most organizations is a lot of money. So having to pay and negotiate that certainly isn't a lot of fun, I can imagine.
No, but I mean, there's suggestions that their manufacturing facilities in Taiwan were down for at least 2 days because of this attack. 10 million, to be fair, to resolve a public relations crisis combined with manufacturing problems starts to become more and more justifiable to the board. I mean, we don't know how much money that was actually paid. We do believe the ransom demand was $10 million, and they were negotiating through a Proton Mail account. So no one outside of the situation knows the details for sure. But they may have paid a small number of millions instead of 10 million. It was quite common at that time for many of these groups that were going big game hunting, where they were really going after big companies for large sums, to make a $10 million demand and then accept 4.5. What a bargain. But, we don't really know. What I found interesting is that because of the allegations that Wasted Locker was connected to Evil Corp, would have made paying that ransom illegal. The United States Treasury Department had already put sanctions against them. So this is, I think, one of the hallmarks of when we're talking here is it's not always about the bits and bytes and the encryption keys. It's also about the lawyers and the Congress people and the government and the laws.
Yeah, I think the other argument there, though, is Garmin aren't actually based. They started off as an American company, but I think they're actually Swiss now. So I think their main holdings is in Sweden. So that may be why they're able to pay that. You're much better when it comes to legislation and things like but that could be maybe their saving grace.
Yeah, there's a couple other factors that could have played into this as well. We do know that the Treasury Department does have a process that in a crisis like this, if you've got good reason that violating the sanction is going to protect safety or property, this kind of thing, you can make a request for an exemption to the policy. So that you can proceed despite it normally being unlawful. The other option, which is probably what actually happened, is it sounds like they contacted an incident response firm and said that they wanted to pay the ransom, and that firm, because of the sanctions, apparently backed out. And then another firm called Arete, I think, Arete, I'm not sure, Arete, Incident Response, did take them on as a customer. They never confirmed, well, I should say it's unconfirmed that they took them on as a customer, but they were speaking with authority about the issue publicly. And it certainly looks like they were the ones that facilitated the payment. Coincidentally, around the same time, this same company posted on their Twitter account that they had been investigating Wasted Locker and had thought it was inconclusive that they were related to Evil Corp. around the same time they were experiencing all this criticism for potentially facilitating a ransom payment to a sanctioned entity. Mysteriously, here in 2024, that opinion that they posted with a PDF is no longer available, but I did find it on archive.org, and it will be in the show notes, showing their arguments of it's not being attributed to Evil Corp, and mysteriously they've taken that down. So maybe they've had a change of heart, but it does look pretty conclusive that they represented Garmin with the negotiations with the criminals.
You and I also both work day to day looking at threat groups, and I think it's pretty much agreed upon now that Wasted Locker was associated with Evil Corp, right? Maybe there's some room for a small amount of room for debate, but I think quite confidently we can attribute those two groups to be working together or to be much the same.
I totally agree. I'm not giving any credit to the concept that they were distinct, but you could certainly see how an organization that was going to facilitate this payment might have an interest in putting forth an argument that maybe they weren't.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, it's throw some doubt out
it's
there.
It's an unbelievable coincidence that was the exact week they decided to publish a PDF explaining their rationale. So
it's not a bad business model. Laundering money between victims and ransomware crews. You take your sweet 10% off the top, and I don't know. Maybe that's a future business model we can consider. We'll see how the podcast goes.
Well, the ransomware groups certainly seem to be making a lot of money. I noticed those videos of Maxim Yakubits, the person allegedly behind Evil Corp, that's been personally sanctioned by the United States, and him doing donuts in the middle of streets in Moscow in his Audi race cars and his Lamborghinis that are done in camouflage paint jobs, and he had lion cubs as pets. They're kind of living the high life.
That's truly unbelievable, honestly. So one of the things that I think that's interesting, that's part of this attack, is the actual decryptor itself. And this is something that we talk to a lot of organizations about. You go through, you pay the $10 million or however much they chose to pay, and then you receive the decryption key. And typically, I don't know if you agree with this, typically when you pay the ransom, you do receive a valid decryption key. And I remember early days of ransomware back in 2015, there was some groups that weren't too honest. You'd pay and the decryption key wouldn't work. But from what we saw from this attack, there was a batch file, so a Windows script file that had a decryption key in it. But it was incredibly slow and a long process. So it looks like there was actually a third party that was contacted that specialize in writing decryptors that received the script that that Wasted Locker provided to say, you're welcome to have your files back. Thank you for paying. It's as good as a receipt in this case. They then reached out to a third-party development firm that had to write a decryptor that meant that the files could be decrypted en masse far faster than, what this Windows script that was provided would be. So, a lot of the time when you talk to organizations about breaches and, I'm going to pay to get my files back, it seems like it's going to be straightforward. Once you pay the ransom, the attack's over. But that actually wasn't the case with Garmin either. It still required more time to get a custom decryptor created so all their files and systems could have their services restored.
Yeah, if I've said it once, I've probably said it 1,000 times already, that the criminals put much more effort into the encryption than the decryption parts of their code. And if you've ever been upset with any legitimate software company's quality assurance processes, don't count on the criminals to give you a well QA'd tool that's going to be efficient and work properly. I mean, the good news is once you have that encryption key, there are a bunch of talented, amazing people out there that you can either pay or sometimes even get to volunteer to help you make a more efficient decryptor. And it's not uncommon that happens in these types of incidents, but it's really the criminals want it to work well enough that they can get away with saying they honored their promise to give you the data.
So you've gone through, they've paid the $10 million, they've started to restore the data. From your opinion, is the attack over from there? What what's the next steps look like for a victim? Is it as simple as, business is restored, or is there further work involved typically with this kind of attack?
A wise victim, hopefully. Because that's obviously whenever you've had a breach of your perimeter and a pretty disabling event like this, you've got multiple concerns, right? You need to be going back and looking at your strategy overall to see where the gaps were that allowed this type of an incident to occur. But you also have to be looking at your recovery processes. I think paying a ransom is a rather poor outcome, and I would not be proud that I found a way to funnel, let's just say, at least millions of money to a sanctioned entity that has been holding me for ransom and extortion. It's not a proud moment, so you'd hope you'd reflect on that. But there's also often not a satisfying conclusion to a lot of these attacks. I mean, in this case, we think it started with Sot Ghoulish. I read the same information you did on people that have looked into that. That's possible, but it's also possible that it was combined with a stolen credential. I mean, doing the forensics on these things can be really hard if you're not well prepared. And I guess maybe you don't want to be well prepared so you can unravel your incident, but it's a better outcome than not being well prepared for it.
Yeah, and that's where you really need to look. I wouldn't be confident getting a decryptor, unlocking all of the files and being like, all right, business back to normal. Everybody start coding again, start monitoring systems again. Let's start our R&D department. I would be far more inclined to burn most of the systems down, re-image everything, change the passwords, and go from there. And let's assume, and I think we can be quite confident that it was, a news website or a breached website. Everything that I've found seems to indicate that Sot Ghoulish was the cause of this breach. So based on the information available, we can say that Sot Ghoulish was, to be blamed for this. But then you need to go back as well and say, well, can anybody just put a malicious website out there, get my users to browse to it, and then malicious code's going to execute on this system and give attackers access to my systems? Does that mean we're only one bad click away from going through this again? Is this going to be an annual thing for us, a 6-monthly thing for us? So you need to really take a hard look at your own device policies to say, well, why was an end user able to execute something that was malicious? Was this a failure of policy? Do we need to be stricter on anything that gets executed on this device? Do we need to review our antivirus? Did we not have certain policies turned on, or was our antivirus just not doing a job that the data sheet said that it could do? So there's a lot of takeaways to go back to the very beginning to say, what can we do better next time to ensure that we're not a victim again?
Again, that's the wise customer speaking, because I think too many of them do just get back to business, and we have to remember, the very fundamentals of our training as security professionals, if we've been able to have some. It usually focuses around CIA, and of course the I is integrity. And after a criminal has fully owned your systems, it's pretty hard to argue they have any integrity after that. So I'm with you on we should probably burn it all down. The problem is, it's known as MBAs. People go to business school and they don't want to spend money, and they don't share our technical opinions and acumen, right? So I think a really skilled security leader in Garmin's position is going to do all the things you're talking about, looking into making sure there's more layers to that safety net and trying to identify the root cause, make sure it's eliminated or the risk is reduced at least, and that kind of thing. But we also need to figure out how to communicate that effectively to senior management and the board of directors, depending on your structure of your organization, because you're ultimately having to strike a balance between the idealistic techie that wants to burn it all down and rebuild everything, and the company's goal, which is, we just wrote a check to criminals for $6 million. What do you mean we have to rebuild our systems? And there's something in between that a very skilled security leader can hopefully strike the right balance and at least ensure that it tilts toward the further safety and security of the organization.
Absolutely. So if we were to, we've gone through this journey of what happened, who the victims were, decryption. If we look at some key takeaways, I'm happy to start with this one, is for me, that communication strategy, as you highlighted earlier, was wrong. Waiting 4 days to notify people. I don't know about you. One of the things that I've noticed is transparency always seems to be praised by general consumers, and we've seen we've seen so many serious incidents. We've seen a lot of supply chain attacks, and I would consider this a supply chain attack, considering especially the value that Garmin adds to the aviation industry. People need to know. I don't think it's fair to let your customers sit in the dark and wonder why their bike computer won't sync or why they can't upload their flight plans. Like, I feel like, and I don't want to criticize anyone at Garmin too directly, because it is probably the worst day of a lot of people's career, what happened. But the choice for their PR team, that are clearly very skilled, they're doing product launches every day. They're constantly coming up with new technology. They're well funded. They've got a great PR team. But to try and treat a cybersecurity incident as something that they need to hide is potentially the worst thing, and a great way to get your customers offside with you. So, to everybody listening today, if I can recommend one thing, it's let's be more transparent. Let people learn from your mistakes, but also don't let your consumers sit in the dark and learn what's going on from, X, Facebook, Threads, Reddit. Don't let that speculation occur. You're much better to come out and say what it is from the very beginning, and that way you can focus on recovery and not have to, mold the narrative that you're trying to get everything under control, when realistically, if you had said, hey, we've been encrypted, we're negotiating, we're trying to restore services, we'll be back online as soon as possible, people aren't going to sit there and refresh their phone or their aviation platform over and over again. So communication is super important. And yeah, let's use Garmin as a poster child of how not to communicate. 4 days is not acceptable as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I think we could partially put it in context for the time as well, though, and not that 4 years ago is all that long ago, but in strange ways it is. It was partly during the pandemic, and I think that we're used to huddling around a table and working together, and perhaps that disrupted the communication flows and effective communications on how to handle a incident like this, that sometimes when you're sitting around over a pizza or something, it works out a little easier. But more importantly, what we have now with the new Securities and Exchange Commission rules in the United States, having to report incidents on these 8K forms, that kind of thing, I think has removed some of the stigma. Like, it seems like there was stigma around admitting it was a cyber attack, like somehow that you weren't the victim of a crime and it was some moral failure or something. Where now, because organizations are regularly required to publicly report it, maybe we'll see more openness.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Because that was 2020. Even if you look, like, the Australian government kind of copied the EU when it came to like mandatory disclosure of breaches, and that was only a year prior. So you're right. This was during potentially a lockdown for the company as well, with people remote for the first time. So things would have been harder. So maybe I was a little bit too harsh. But that's a really good point. I think mandatory reporting hopefully will make it easier for people to be like, all right, well, we don't need to hide it, because the government knows about it now. And, as long as we're not going to be treated or fined based on the attack, and maybe even get some support from professionals that are government funded, that's not a bad thing, right?
Yeah, not at all. And so I guess if I had any points to add, it would simply be around probably a more traditional topic for us, business continuity. The poor communication could probably solidly be blamed on there not being a plan for what they were going to say when this happened. They hadn't rehearsed or planned for this to happen. Nobody plans to be a victim necessarily, but smart organizations typically know that you're going to have a certain number of all kinds of incidents in your business, and some of them are going to be health related, and some of them are going to be natural disaster related, and some of them are going to be cyber related. And when you have a plan, it always goes a lot more smoothly. And to me, it's pretty clear when we see a lot of these high profile incidents that we're likely to talk about here in this podcast. There's usually, obviously, the hindsight makes it a lot easier seeing what happened, but you can usually read into a bit the response and tell what level of preparation, planning, or thought they had about this. And while this one certainly does not score incredibly low on the scale, as a few recently have, I think that poor communication might have been a result of not having a plan in place of how they would communicate and having carefully weighed all those factors about reputation and confidence from your customers. And these things are hard to do in the spur of the moment, and that's why you make poor decisions in the spur of the moment. Yeah, I hate to plan to fail, but like I think we have to assume that defenses are never going to be perfect, and be sure that when they fail, that we have a backup plan.
Yep. Perfect.
Well, I guess that concludes episode number 2. We've really enjoyed the outreach. We had fun recently at Black Hat in Las Vegas, meeting people and giving away some of our cool Security Take 2 stickers, which I still have a box of here, so I'll maybe start posting publicly when I'm going to events, and I'll have some stickers if anybody wants one. But you can also reach out to us on YouTube /at Security Take 2, or on Mastodon at securitycafe.ca /at Security Take 2. And Ben, we're on Reddit as well, right?
We certainly are. So it is reddit.com/r/security take 2.
And being that we're just kicking things off, we'd love your feedback. So please share it with us, or go to our website for more contact info. And we will share another case with all of you very soon. Thanks for subscribing.